The photograph measures 3 inches by 4. Sepia tones bleed through the cardstock backing, faded now to the color of weak tea left too long in sunlight. The emulsion has cracked in places, fine as spider silk, creating tiny fissures that branch across the surface like tributaries on an ancient map. When held at certain angles, the glass plate beneath catches light in a way that makes the image seem to shift, to breathe almost, though that is impossible. 4 walls of a modest parlor frame the scene. A window to the left, curtains drawn back just enough to allow the afternoon sun through. Dust motes hang suspended in that captured beam, frozen mid-dance for 121 years. 5 children sit arranged around a small table. Their hands rest folded in their laps, fingers interlaced with the careful precision taught by mothers who believed stillness was next to godliness. The exposure required for 1894 photography demanded absolute motionlessness, sometimes for 30 seconds or more, and these children have obeyed. Their faces hold that particular blankness that comes from forced composure, eyes fixed on a point just beyond the lens where the photographer would have stood, one hand raised to mark the count. The youngest appears no more than 4 years old. The eldest might be 12. Between them, 3 others, spaced by what seems like 2-year intervals, each dressed in their Sunday best, despite the Tuesday afternoon hour, noted in faint pencil on the photograph's reverse side. A birthday cake occupies the center of the table, 3 layers poorly frosted by inexpert hands, the kind of imperfection that speaks of love rather than skill. 5 candles emerge from the top tier, their wax forms rendered pale gray in the monochrome image. The flame captured mid-flicker on one appears as a white blur, a ghost of combustion preserved in silver halide crystals. A knife rests beside the cake, its blade reflecting something the modern eye cannot quite parse. Beside each child, a small plate waits empty. 5 plates for 5 children, 5 chairs pulled close to the table edge, 5 shadows falling at identical angles across the wooden floorboards, though the light source should not create such uniformity. The room itself whispers of working-class aspiration, wallpaper with a repeating floral pattern, probably purchased from the Sears catalog that year. A shelf in the background holds what appear to be books, their spines too blurred to read but arranged with deliberate care. On the wall behind the children, a framed cross-stitch sampler, the kind that proclaimed blessings upon the home in carefully stitched letters. Everything speaks of order, of routine, of a family that knew its place in the world and kept that place tidy. But the portrait was breathing. Not literally, of course. Photographs do not breathe. Yet something in the arrangement feels alive in a way that transcends mere documentation. Perhaps it is the way the children's eyes seem to track movement even in stillness. Perhaps it is the quality of light that appears wrong somehow, as if the sun that day fell from a sky that no longer exists. Or perhaps it is something else entirely, something that only becomes clear when the image is examined closely, when the modern viewer brings technology to bear on this fragment of the past and asks it to reveal what the naked eye missed. 5 chairs around that table, 5 children in those chairs, 5 candles burning on that cake. The family name was Haraway. The town was Millbrook, a settlement of 400 souls, nestled in the crook of the Allegheny foothills, where Pennsylvania farmland began its slow transition to forest. The date marked on the back reads March 17, 1904. The photographer's stamp appears in faded purple ink along the bottom edge. Branson Studio, Main Street, established 1889. Nothing about these details suggests anything beyond ordinary commemoration, a birthday captured for posterity, a moment preserved so that someday, years hence, these children might look back and remember when they were young. No one remembered to count the chairs before the photograph was taken. Or perhaps someone did count and found the number correct, which raises questions that have no comfortable answers. The image exists. It has existed for more than a century, passed from hand to hand, sold at estate sales, filed in archives, scanned into digital collections. Thousands of eyes have passed over it without noticing, without asking, without enhancing the fifth child's face, to see what hides there in the grain of the emulsion, waiting to be found. Before we continue, let us know in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to hear it. And if you are enjoying the content, give the video a like to help support the channel. Now, sit back, relax, and enjoy the story. The year was 1904, and that photograph would become the only surviving record of a birthday that never happened. The Haraway family rose with the sun. This was not exceptional in Millbrook, where most households kept farmers' hours regardless of occupation. Thomas Haraway worked as a clerk at the rail office, documenting freight manifests and passenger lists in careful copperplate script. His wife, Margaret, managed the home and 4 children with the same meticulous attention to detail her husband brought to his ledgers. Theirs was a life of modest comfort, the kind that could be maintained through discipline and careful budgeting, where luxuries were few but necessities never wanting. Ruth was the eldest at 12. She had inherited her mother's severe countenance and her father's head for figures. Teachers at the Millbrook schoolhouse predicted she would make an excellent governess someday, perhaps even a teacher herself if ambition and circumstance aligned. She took her role as oldest seriously, helping with the younger children's lessons, ensuring they washed behind their ears and said their prayers each night before bed. In the photograph, she sits at the far left, her posture perfect, her gaze level and calm. Clara came next at 10. Where Ruth was serious, Clara possessed a quiet brightness that manifested in small ways, a skill for drawing, a talent for memorizing poetry, a laugh that came easily even when circumstances seemed to discourage joy. She had been sick that winter with a fever that left her thin and pale, but by March she had recovered enough to resume her normal routines. Her position in the photograph places her second from the left, her hands folded so tightly that the knuckles appear white even through the sepia tones. James was 8. The only boy among the children, he bore the weight of future expectation with the resignation of someone who understood there was no escaping it. He would inherit his father's position at the rail office someday, or perhaps find work at the mill if the rail company failed. His childhood was a waiting room for adulthood, and he seemed to sense this even at 8 years old. He sits third from the left, his collar starched so stiffly it appears to chafe his neck, a redness visible even in the faded image. Edith was 6. She had been born during a difficult winter when snowdrifts reached the eaves, and Margaret had labored for 18 hours before the midwife finally pulled the child free. Perhaps this traumatic entry into the world explained her temperament, withdrawn, anxious, prone to nightmares that woke the household. She rarely smiled. In the photograph, she sits 4th from the left, her expression as blank as stone. And then there was the 5th child. Margaret Haraway began preparations 3 days before the birthday. The house was cleaned with an intensity that suggested more than ordinary tidiness. Floors scrubbed, windows washed, curtains taken down and beaten until no dust remained. She baked the cake herself, refusing help from Ruth despite the girl's insistence that she could manage the frosting. The recipe came from Margaret's own mother, written in faded pencil on a scrap of paper that had survived 2 generations. 3 layers of yellow cake with cream filling between. Simple, but made with attention. The day itself arrived cold and bright. March in western Pennsylvania meant the last gasp of winter, mornings that froze breath into clouds, afternoons that hinted at the spring to come. Margaret rose early to starch the children's clothing, heating the iron on the stove until it hissed when touched to damp fabric. She dressed them one by one, buttoning collars, smoothing skirts, checking fingernails for dirt. Thomas had arranged for Mr. Branson to come at 2 in the afternoon, when the light would be best. Mr. Branson arrived precisely on time. He was 73 years old that spring, a man who had photographed 3 generations of Millbrook families and who knew every technical trick required to coax a good image from imperfect conditions. His hands trembled slightly from palsy as he set up his equipment, the large format camera on its wooden tripod, the glass plates in their protective cases, the flash powder that would supplement the window light if necessary. He worked slowly, methodically, adjusting the angle and framing the shot through the ground glass screen on the camera's back. The children were called to sit, Ruth first, then Clara, then James, then Edith. They arranged themselves without argument, having been drilled in proper behavior for the past hour. Margaret lit the candles on the cake, 5 small flames that guttered slightly in a draft no one could locate. The windows were closed. The doors were shut. Yet the candles flickered as if touched by invisible breath. Mr. Branson peered through his lens and paused. He counted the children silently, his lips moving. Then he emerged from beneath the focusing cloth and counted again, this time aloud. 1, 2, 3, 4. He looked at Margaret with confusion beginning to form in his clouded eyes. How many children did she have? 4, she told him. 4 children. He nodded slowly and returned to his camera, but his hands shook worse than before as he prepared the plate. The 5th chair had been added at the last minute. Margaret herself had placed it there, dragging it from the corner where it usually stood empty. She had set a plate before it. She had told the children to move slightly to make room. When Thomas asked why 5 chairs for 4 children, she had not answered. She had only stared at that 5th chair with an expression that was neither grief nor joy, but something older than both. Mr. Branson called for stillness. The children froze. He removed the lens cap and began his count. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18. The shutter closed. In the corner of Mr. Branson's vision, just before he replaced the lens cap, something small had moved, a shift of shadow where no shadow should be. A 5th shape among the 4, but when he looked directly at the spot, he saw nothing unusual. Only 4 children arranged around a birthday cake, waiting to be told they could move again. No one would remember lighting that 5th candle, but everyone remembered who blew it out. Night fell over Millbrook with the particular silence that comes to small towns in early spring, when the earth has not yet thawed enough to support the full chorus of insects and animals that will arrive with warmer months. The Haraway house stood dark by 9 o'clock, its windows reflecting nothing but starlight and the distant glow of other homes settling into sleep. Inside, the children lay in their beds, Ruth and Clara sharing one room, James in his small chamber, Edith in the narrow space that had once been a storage closet but had been converted when she was born. Margaret checked on them as she did, every night. She moved from room to room in her nightdress, feet bare on cold floorboards, confirming that each child breathed steadily in sleep. Ruth had kicked her blanket off. Margaret pulled it back over her daughter's thin shoulders. Clara slept curled on her side, one hand tucked beneath her cheek. James lay flat on his back, arms at his sides like a soldier. Edith whimpered softly, already dreaming her anxious dreams. 4 children accounted for. Margaret stood in the hallway between the rooms for a long moment, listening to the house settle. Somewhere in the walls, timber creaked. The wind found gaps in the window frames and produced a low whistle that might have been mistaken for breathing. She returned to her own bed and lay beside Thomas, who snored softly, undisturbed by whatever thoughts plagued his wife's rest. At some point between midnight and dawn, Clara's bed became empty. Ruth woke first, as eldest children often do, trained by years of responsibility to maintain half vigilant, even in sleep. The quality of breathing in the room had changed. She opened her eyes to pre-dawn darkness and knew immediately that Clara was gone. Not in the water closet, not downstairs for a drink. Gone in a way that carried weight beyond simple absence. The household erupted into controlled panic. Thomas lit lanterns. Margaret searched every corner of the house, under beds, in closets, behind furniture. They found nothing. No sign of struggle. No indication that the door or windows had been opened. Clara's nightdress lay folded neatly on the chair where she always placed it. Her shoes remained lined up by the wardrobe, yet Clara herself had vanished as thoroughly as smoke dispersed by wind. By first light, Thomas had roused the neighbors. By full morning, half the town searched the surrounding fields and woods. They called Clara's name until their voices grew hoarse. They checked the well, the mill pond, the creek that ran behind the Johnson property. They found nothing. No tracks in the softening mud. No scraps of fabric caught on branches. No body floating in dark water. Only absence where a 10-year-old girl should have been. At the Branson studio on Main Street, the photographer worked alone in his darkroom. The red safe light cast everything in shades of blood as he developed the glass plate from yesterday's sitting. He had been developing photographs for nearly 50 years and knew every stage of the process with the intimacy of long practice. The image emerged slowly from the chemical fog, details surfacing like memories half forgotten. First the table, then the cake, then the children's faces, pale ovals becoming featured with each passing second in the developing solution. Mr. Branson's hand stilled. He lifted the plate from the tray and held it closer to the safe light, squinting through his old eyes at something that should not be there. 5 children sat around that table. He counted them again and again, jabbing his finger at each small figure. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But yesterday there had been only 4. He was certain. He had counted aloud before taking the photograph. 4 children for the Haraway family. The 5th child sat on the far right, at the edge of the frame. A girl, perhaps 6 or 7 years old, dressed in white. Her hands were folded in her lap. Her face turned toward the camera with an expression that Mr. Branson could not quite categorize. Not quite a smile, not quite blankness. Something in between that made his stomach clench with instinctive unease. He set the plate aside and did not make a print. Not that day, not for many days after. He told himself the chemistry had gone bad, that some flaw in the glass had created a phantom image, that his eyes were simply too old to trust anymore. But he knew the truth underneath these comfortable lies. He had photographed something that should not have been there, something that had stepped into frame at the last possible moment and stayed there, preserved in silver crystals, waiting to be discovered. The 5th child's eyes seemed to follow him as he moved around the darkroom. An optical illusion, certainly, a trick of the safe light's glow on wet emulsion. Yet he could not shake the sensation of being watched by something that existed only on glass, only in chemistry, only in that fraction of a second when the shutter had been opened and light had burned its truth into the plate. He locked the negative in a drawer and tried to forget it existed. In Millbrook, the search continued for 3 days. Clara Haraway was not found. The sheriff filed a report that went nowhere. Theories circulated. She had been taken by vagrants, had wandered off and fallen into some hidden ravine, had been carried off by a wild animal, though no such animal had been seen in the area for years. Margaret Haraway stopped eating. Thomas Haraway returned to work after a week, his face carved into new lines that would never fully smooth. Ruth became quieter. James stopped playing. Edith's nightmares worsened until she rarely slept more than a few hours at a time. By dawn of the fourth day, 4 children were accounted for in the Haraway household, and one, captured forever in chemical and glass, was not supposed to be there at all. The studio closed in 1937. Mr. Branson had been dead for 20 years by then, his business kept alive by his son until the Depression made luxuries like portrait photography impossible to sustain. The contents were sold piecemeal, camera equipment to collectors, furniture to second-hand dealers, the building itself to a dry goods company that painted over the windows and forgot what the space had once been. The glass plates went into storage, hundreds of them, each one a fragment of time, a moment stolen from the past and locked in silver and gelatin. They ended up in the basement of the town library, filed in wooden crates that grew dusty and forgotten as years rolled forward. And the world changed in ways that made Millbrook seem even smaller and more remote than it had been in 1904. 1973. A graduate student named Michael Reeves arrived in Millbrook researching the history of early photography in rural Pennsylvania for his thesis. The library provided access to their archive, such as it was. Boxes of old plates, ledgers with partial records, scraps of documentation that had survived through accident rather than intention. Michael spent 3 weeks carefully examining each plate, cataloging what he found, making notes about technical methods and social context. The Haraway family photograph appeared near the bottom of the 3rd crate he examined. The label on the protective sleeve read only Family Group, March 1904. He held it up to the light and paused. Something about the image arrested his attention in a way the dozens of similar family portraits had not. He made a note to print it later and moved on to the next plate. That evening in the darkroom he had set up in his motel room, he placed the Haraway negative in the enlarger. Modern equipment far superior to what Branson would have used. Bright tungsten lamp, high-quality lens. He projected the image onto photographic paper and began to see details that the original photographer might never have noticed. The 5th child's face came into focus last. Michael adjusted the enlarger head, bringing that small figure at the edge of the frame into sharp relief. And there, revealed by modern technology applied to ancient chemistry, something was profoundly wrong. The smile stretched too wide. Not dramatically, not in the way of obvious manipulation or double exposure. Just slightly too wide for the context, too wide for a child sitting still for a formal portrait. The teeth were visible, which was unusual for photographs of this era where smiles were discouraged. And the eyes. The pupils held a sharpness that did not match the soft focus affecting the rest of the image. They appeared hollow somehow, as if lit from within by a light source that had not existed in that parlor. Michael made several prints at different exposures, trying to convince himself he was seeing artifacts of the printing process, but the effect persisted. At every exposure level, the 5th child's face held that too wide grin, those 2 sharp eyes. He examined the other children for comparison. Their expressions were perfectly normal for the period, solemn still, appropriately serious. Only the 5th child smiled. He began researching the Haraway family. Census records for 1900 showed Thomas and Margaret Haraway with 3 children, Ruth, Clara, and James. The 1910 census listed only Ruth, James, and Edith. Clara's name had disappeared. Death records showed no Clara Haraway in the intervening years. She had simply vanished from documentation as if she had never existed at all. The Town Historical Society had a single reference to the Haraways in their collection, a brief mention in a diary kept by a woman named Abigail Thornton who had lived 3 houses down. The entry dated March 19, 1904. Search continues for the Haraway girl. 2nd day now. Margaret looks like a ghost herself. Strange about that birthday photograph. Thomas says only 4 children sat for it, but Margaret insists she sat 5 places. The grief has affected her mind, I think. Michael found the original seating plan in a folder of Branson's studio documents, a small scrap of paper in feminine handwriting, Margaret Haraway's presumably, a simple diagram showing 4 chairs around a table, 4 children labeled Ruth, Clara, James, Edith. No 5th name, no 5th chair, yet the photograph clearly showed 5 seats, 5 children, 5 plates, 5 chairs, 1 too many. He returned to the negative and examined it under magnification. In the reflection on the cake knife, visible only at high magnification, a face, not quite aligned with any of the children at the table, a 6th presence perhaps, or a doubling of the 5th. The angle was wrong for it to be a simple reflection. The perspective did not match the geometry of the room. On the glass plate itself, near the upper left corner, a mark. At first Michael thought it was a scratch, one of the many minor damages that old plates accumulated over decades of storage. But when he looked closer, he saw it was not random. It had shape, structure. It looked like a handprint, small, child-sized, pressed against the glass from inside, as if someone trapped in the emulsion had reached toward the surface trying to break through. The artifact had outlived every witness, but it remembered more than it should. The digital scan arrived via email on a Tuesday in late October 2023. The subject line read, "Strange family portrait. Thought this might interest you." The sender was an estate sale liquidator in Pittsburgh who had found the photograph in a box of ephemera purchased from a storage unit auction. She knew the recipient ran a YouTube channel dedicated to historical mysteries and thought this particular image might make good content. The file downloaded slowly, its resolution higher than typical scans from this era. When it finally opened, the investigator, we will call him David, a pseudonym he uses for privacy, spent several minutes simply staring at it. He had seen hundreds of similar portraits from the early 1900s, Victorian death photos, spirit photography, double exposures meant to capture ghosts. This one felt different, not obviously manipulated, not dramatic in its strangeness, just wrong in a way that bypassed rational analysis and struck somewhere deeper. He began the process he had refined over 3 years of running the channel. Reverse image search to check for existing documentation, genealogical databases to trace the family name, historical society contacts in the area where the photo was presumably taken. The Branson studio stamp provided a starting point. Millbrook, Pennsylvania, population 378 according to the latest census. A town slowly dying as young people moved away and old people aged into graves. The Millbrook Public Library had been closed for budget reasons in 2015, its collection absorbed into the county system. David called and was transferred 3 times before reaching someone who confirmed they had the old Branson studio materials. But no, they had never been properly cataloged, and no one had requested access in years. He scheduled a visit for the following week. The drive took 6 hours through increasingly remote countryside. Millbrook had shrunk since 1904, its population down to 240. The main street where Branson Studio once stood was half abandoned, its buildings empty except for a diner and a post office. The library branch occupied a converted storefront, 3 rooms of shelves and 2 computers for public use. The Branson materials filled 4 archive boxes in a back room. David signed paperwork and began his search. He found the original negative within an hour, filed under Haraway in spidery handwriting. He also found Michael Reeves's notes from 1973, including his prints and his research documentation. The graduate student had been thorough, every available record traced, every inconsistency noted. David photographed everything with his digital camera, using lighting techniques that brought out details invisible to the naked eye. He scanned the negative at the highest resolution his equipment allowed. Back at his hotel that evening, he imported the files into photo editing software and began the process of enhancement. Modern software can do things that Michael Reeves in 1973 could not have imagined. Algorithms that sharpen edges, filters that reveal details hidden in shadow, computational photography that builds on machine learning, trained on millions of images. David applied these tools methodically, working through the photograph in sections. The fifth child's face emerged in a sharp relief. The smile that had seemed merely wide in earlier examinations now revealed teeth too uniform, too bright, as if caught by a light source that did not exist in that dim parlor. The eyes held a reflection that should not be there, a window behind the camera, perhaps, except the room had no such window. The skin texture appeared wrong at high magnification, too smooth, almost translucent, as if the child were not quite solid. He enhanced the background and found new anomalies. A shadow on the wall behind the children that did not correspond to any of them. A distortion in the wallpaper pattern near the fifth child's head, as if the image had been warped or the fabric of reality had bent. In the depths of Clara's eyes, visible only at maximum zoom, a reflection. The fifth child's face, inverted, impossible given the angles involved. David compiled his research into a database. Birth records, death records, census data, newspaper archives. The pattern that emerged was troubling. Clara Haraway had been born on March the 17th, 1894. The birthday photograph was taken on her 10th birthday. She disappeared that night and was never found. But there was more. Parish records from the Millbrook Episcopal Church, where the Haraways attended services, showed a baptism in 1896. Not Clara, another daughter, name Constance Haraway, born July 3, 1895, died November 11, 1896, age 16 months, cause scarlet fever, buried in the church cemetery in a plot that no longer bore a marker, its location known only through maps drawn before the stones weathered into illegibility. Constance would have been the same age as the fifth child in the photograph. Or would have been if she had lived to 1904, if she had grown beyond 16 months, if death had not taken her 8 years before that birthday cake was lit, and those children were called to sit for a portrait that should have shown 4. The audio began playing while David was reviewing his footage that night. He had recorded several hours of ambient sound in the library, hoping to use it as background for his video. The recording should have contained only the hum of fluorescent lights, the occasional creak of the old building, perhaps traffic noise from outside. Instead, at the 32-minute mark, something else emerged from the static. Children's voices, distant, singing happy birthday in the wavering tones of young children who have not yet learned to carry a melody. The song played through once, then stopped, then began again, then stopped, then began again. Always the same recording, the same imperfections, as if whatever had captured this moment had become stuck in an infinite loop, replaying the same few seconds forever. David checked his equipment, no interference, no nearby source. The sound existed only in that 30-second window of the recording, appearing from nothing and vanishing to nothing, leaving only silence. He returned to the enhanced photograph and examined the metadata embedded in the digital file. Modern cameras and scanners record extensive information: date, time, device model, location if GPS is enabled. But buried in the metadata was something that should not be there. A field labeled subject names. It should have been empty. Instead, it contained text: Ruth, Clara, James, Edith, and her, and her. Not a name, not an identifier, just 2 words acknowledging presence without claiming identity. a placeholder for something that had been there, in the frame, in the moment, but which resisted being named or known or documented in any conventional way. But when the image was enhanced once more, zooming past the limits of optical resolution into the realm of computational extrapolation, the fifth child blinked. The letter was discovered in a safety deposit box at Millbrook Savings and Loan, liquidated after the bank closed in 2018. Among the unclaimed boxes was one registered to Margaret Haraway, paid through 1942 and then abandoned when payments ceased. The contents were minimal: a few pieces of jewelry, some old coins, and a single envelope addressed to no one, sealed with red wax that had cracked but not broken over the decades. The county clerk forwarded it to David after learning about his research into the Haraway family. He opened it carefully, preserving the seal, and found 3 pages written in faded ink, the handwriting shaky but legible. The letter was dated December 7, 1941. Margaret Haraway had been 73 years old when she wrote it. She would die 6 months later. The text began without preamble. "I have carried this truth for 37 years and will carry it to my grave, but I cannot leave this world without setting down what happened so that someone, someday, might understand. They will think me mad. Perhaps I am. But madness does not erase truth. It only makes truth harder to bear." She described Constance's death in detail, the fever that came suddenly in early November, the convulsions, the desperate attempts to cool the child's burning skin, the moment when breathing stopped and the small body went still, the burial 3 days later in ground that had already begun to freeze, the way Thomas had forbidden her from speaking Constance's name after the funeral, insisting that dwelling on loss would poison the living. But Margaret had not been able to let go. She described sitting in Constance's empty room, still decorated as a nursery, though they had needed the space for James. She described talking to the absent child, telling her about the day's events, asking her questions and imagining answers. She described feeling Constance's presence in the house, not frightening, just there, a warmth in certain corners, a sense of being watched by loving eyes. By the time we arranged Clara's 10th birthday photograph, Margaret wrote, "I had long since accepted that Constance remained with us. I set 5 places at table. I bought fabric for 5 dresses, though only 4 were worn. I told Thomas it comforted me to keep her memory alive. He thought it grief speaking. Perhaps it was. But grief becomes its own form of reality when held long enough and with sufficient faith." The day of the photograph, Margaret had set the 5th chair deliberately. She had placed a plate before it. When the other children questioned this, she had told them it was for their sister, the one who had died before they could remember her, the one who should have been there to celebrate with them. Ruth had understood in the solemn way of oldest children who learn early about death. Clara had seemed confused but accepting. James had looked frightened. Edith had started crying and had to be calmed. "When Mr. Branson arranged the children," Margaret continued, "I saw Constance standing beside the table, clear as daylight, clear as any of the others. She wore white. She smiled at me with the smile she had given at 16 months, the smile that had been her first and last gift to us. I told her to sit. I told her this birthday was for her as much as for Clara. She sat in the 5th chair and folded her hands, just as I had taught the others to do." Mr. Branson had seen nothing unusual. He had counted 4 children and questioned the extra chair, but Margaret had not explained. She had only insisted the photograph be taken exactly as arranged. When he had finished and begun packing his equipment, Margaret had thanked him and paid his fee and asked when the prints would be ready. 3 days, he told her. 3 days to develop the glass plate and make the copies. That night, Clara vanished. I knew immediately what had happened. I knew because I had seen Constance blow out the candles on that cake all 5 at once, though none of the living children had been asked to blow yet. I had seen Clara watching her sister, the sister she had never met, the sister who should not have been there, with an expression of recognition that defied all logic. And I had seen Constance take Clara's hand under the table, their fingers interlacing in a way that seemed both tender and terrible. Margaret described searching for Clara, calling her name, tearing apart the house room by room, the days that followed, the town's searches, the sheriff's questions. She had said nothing about Constance. She had said nothing about the 5th chair. She had endured their suspicions, that she had harmed Clara in some fit of grief madness, that she was hiding the body, that her obsession with her dead daughter had driven her to destroy the living one. I believe Constance took her, Margaret wrote, not from malice, not from evil, but from loneliness. She had been alone for 8 years while the family grew around the empty space she had left. And when given the opportunity, when I invited her back into our circle, even for a moment, she could not bear to return to absence. She needed company in whatever place she inhabited. She needed a sister. The letter described how Margaret had gone to Branson's studio 3 weeks after Clara's disappearance, demanding to see the photograph. Mr. Branson had been reluctant, sensing something wrong in her intensity, but he had shown her the negative, and there, visible to her eyes because she knew what to look for, were both daughters, Constance in the 5th chair, solid and present as any of the others, and Clara beside her, already fading at the edges, already becoming translucent, already crossing from one state of being into another. "I do not expect to be believed," the letter concluded. "I do not expect forgiveness. I invited death into my home because I could not accept it, had already visited. I set a place for a ghost, and a ghost claimed what I offered. My living daughter paid the price for my inability to let go. I have spent 37 years living with this knowledge, and I tell you truthfully, it is a burden worse than any hell theology promises. If you find this letter, if you find the photograph, I beg you to destroy both. Some doors, once opened, should not be looked through. Some truths are not meant for the light." David sat with the letter for a long time, reading it again and again. He then pulled up the enhanced photograph on his computer and examined the 5th child's face once more. The too wide smile, the too sharp eyes, the sense of something that was both there and not there, both captured and escaping, both real and impossible. He measured the lighting on each child's face using photometric analysis software. 4 children showed consistent shadow patterns corresponding to the window light Branson had used. The 5th child's face showed no shadows at all, no variation in tone, as if lit by a source that existed everywhere and nowhere, or as if the light passed through rather than reflecting off. Impossible under the laws of physics that governed the photograph's creation. Impossible unless the 5th child had not been subject to those laws. Scientific analysis confirmed what Margaret's letter claimed. The 5th child existed in the photograph but not of it, present but not corporeal, captured by the camera because cameras, unlike human eyes, record light without judgment, without distinguishing between what should be there and what is there. The emulsion had preserved what Margaret saw, what Constance was, without question or interpretation. David spent 3 days considering what to do with this information. Margaret had asked that the photograph be destroyed, but destruction felt like erasure, and erasure felt like a second death for both girls. The photograph was evidence of something science could not explain and faith could not quite accommodate. A space between provable and believable, where truth resided in forms that resisted conventional documentation. He thought about grief, about how it manifests, about how parents who lose children sometimes keep rooms untouched, clothes unworn, places set at dinner tables for children who will never eat again. about how this preservation of absence is both comfort and torture, about how Margaret Haraway had taken this common gesture and somehow made it real, or had encountered something already real that she had simply chosen to acknowledge. The philosophical question embedded in the photograph transcended its historical context. If memory can summon the dead, if grief held with sufficient intensity can preserve what should have passed, then what does a camera truly capture when it opens its shutter to the world? The second letter was found among the papers Michael Reeves had left when he died in 2011. His widow donated his research, materials to Penn State's photography archive, and a librarian sorting through the collection noticed the Haraway file marked "Do Not Circulate." Inside was a photocopy of a letter that Margaret Haraway had sent to Mr. Branson in April of 1904, 1 month after Clara's disappearance. The handwriting was the same as the safety deposit box letter, but steadier, written before the decades of carrying impossible knowledge had worn her down. It was brief, only half a page, but it contained a detail that changed everything. "Dear Mr. Branson," it began, "I am writing to request all prints and the original negative from the birthday photograph taken March 17th. I understand this is unusual, but I am willing to pay double your asking price. The photograph has caused my family great distress, and I wish to ensure no copies remain in circulation. Please reply at your earliest convenience." Below this, in different handwriting, Branson's shaky script, a note. Replied April 20th. Informed Mrs. Haraway the negative had been damaged during development and no satisfactory prints could be made. Offered to retake the photograph at no charge. She declined. The negative remains in my possession. I have printed it 5 times now. Each print shows the same 5 children. Each print of the 5th child's face ages differently while the others remain unchanged. I do not understand. I dare not destroy what I do not understand. David obtained permission to access the 5 prints Branson had made. They were stored separately in the archive, each in its own protective sleeve, each labeled with the date of printing, March the 21st, 1904, April 5th, 1904, May 2nd, 1904, June 7th, 1904, July 15th, 1904. He laid them out side by side and photographed them under controlled lighting. The differences were subtle but unmistakable. In the first print, the 5th child appeared as she did in the negative, approximately 6 or 7 years old, features still soft with baby fat, expression caught between childhood and whatever came after. In the second print, the face had changed, slightly older, 8 perhaps. In the third, older still. By the 5th print, taken 4 months after the photograph was taken, the 5th child looked to be 10 or 11 years old, the same age Clara had been when she disappeared. The other 4 children in the prints remained identical across all 5 versions. Same faces, same expressions, same frozen moment. Only the 5th child moved through time, while time stood still around her. Branson had made notes on the back of each print. First printing, face as captured. Second printing, have I misremembered? She seems older now. Third printing, impossible but undeniable. Fourth printing, she is aging with each development. Fifth printing, she looks like Clara now. God help me, she looks exactly like Clara. David enhanced each print digitally and compared the facial structure of the aging 5th child to the known photograph of Clara Haraway from her school records. By the 5th print, the resemblance was not approximate. It was exact, same bone structure, same spacing of features, same particular tilt to the eyes that gave Clara's face its distinctive character. The 5th child had become Clara, or Clara had become the 5th child, or they had always been the same, and the photograph was simply revealing this truth across multiple developments, showing what was happening to Clara in whatever space she now inhabited. Margaret's letter from the safety deposit box had included a fragment that David had not fully absorbed on first reading. She looked just as she did before the fever, but she would not eat the cake. This referred to Constance, the child Margaret had invited to sit for the photograph. But the detail about not eating was crucial. In the photograph, 4 plates sit with cake slices. 4 forks have been distributed. Only 1 plate remains empty, the one before the 5th chair. The child who should have been eating, the child whose birthday was being celebrated, had not touched her portion because she could not, because whatever she had become existed in a state that did not require or perhaps could not accept physical sustenance. The recurring motif that had threaded through the story from the beginning returned now with new weight. 5 chairs, 1 too many. But perhaps the mathematics were more complex than simple counting suggested. Perhaps it was not 1 chair too many, but 1 chair for someone who existed across states, neither fully present nor fully absent, neither alive in any conventional sense nor wholly removed from the world of the living. David found audio in his library recordings beyond the birthday song. At the 47-minute mark, a voice, female, young, speaking words that were almost but not quite intelligible, as if heard through water or from a great distance. He ran the audio through enhancement software, filtering and amplifying until the words emerged. "We are together now. Tell Mama we are together." The voice repeated this phrase 3 times, then fell silent. David could not determine which child spoke. The timbre was wrong for voice identification, distorted by whatever medium had captured it, or whatever medium the speaker now inhabited. But the message was clear. Constance and Clara, separated by death and life, had found each other again in the space the photograph created. The space Margaret's grief had opened. The space the camera had documented without meaning to. He returned to the enhanced photograph one final time and examined the candles on the cake. In the original image, 5 candles burned, but in the enhanced version, at maximum magnification, only 4 showed the characteristic blur of flame. The 5th candle, the one nearest the 5th child, showed something different. Not flame, but light. Pure light. Shadowless, sourceless. The kind of light that would not flicker because it came from no combustion, existed in no physical state, burned without fuel or heat or oxygen. Every restored version of the image showed the same detail. The 5th candle's light remained constant across all prints, all scans, all enhancements, while other details changed, while the 5th child aged, while shadows shifted with printing techniques, while grain and resolution varied with technology. That single point of light stayed identical, unwavering, eternal, and in every version, 1 candle still burns. The Haraway photograph has been viewed 73,000 times since David uploaded his video in November of 2023. The comments section filled with theories, arguments, accusations of fabrication. Professional photographers examined the image and confirmed its authenticity as an unmanipulated 1904 glass plate negative. Skeptics pointed to the limitations of early photography, double exposures, chemical flaws, optical aberrations. Believers saw evidence of realms beyond material existence, of consciousness persisting beyond death, of love so powerful it could breach whatever membrane separated the living from the dead. David has not revealed the contents of Margaret's letter publicly. Some truths feel too personal, too raw, too intimate to expose to casual consumption. He summarized her confession without details, preserving her privacy even a century after her death. He did not share the detail about the aging prince. He did not share the audio. Some evidence serves best when held in reserve, when allowed to remain partially hidden so that mystery persists alongside revelation. The photograph itself resides now in the Pennsylvania State Archives, accessioned and cataloged, available to researchers who make appropriate requests. The 5 prints are there as well, each in its climate-controlled housing, each carrying its impossible truth. The negative remains fragile, the emulsion lifting at the edges, the glass cracked across one corner. It will not survive forever, perhaps another century if carefully stored, perhaps less. Eventually, only digital copies will remain, and even those will be copies of copies as file formats change and storage media degrades, and the original ones and zeros become translated and retranslated until some essential quality is lost. But for now, it exists. A fragment of 1904 preserved in chemistry and light. A family frozen at the moment before tragedy. 5 children around a birthday cake, 4 of whom were real and 1 of whom was something else. A memory made manifest, a ghost caught by accident, a mother's grief given temporary form. David visits Millbrook twice a year now. He has walked the cemetery where Constance is buried in her unmarked plot. He has stood outside the building that once housed Branson's studio. He has driven past the house where the Haraways lived, now converted into apartments, its interior walls relocated or destroyed, all trace of that parlor erased by time and renovation. The town continues its slow decline, its population dwindling, its young people leaving for cities where futures exist and the past does not press quite so heavily on the present. He thinks about Margaret Haraway often, about a woman who lost one daughter to disease and then lost another to the space she had opened, trying to keep the first one close, about how grief can become its own kind of haunting, how the dead we refuse to bury end up burying the living instead, about how there are forms of love so fierce they become dangerous, that will not accept limitations, that will bargain with whatever forces govern the boundary between existence and absence. The philosophical question the photograph raises has no comfortable answer. If Margaret truly saw Constance that day, if the camera truly recorded her presence, then the implications expand beyond a single family tragedy. Every photograph becomes potentially haunted. Every image might contain figures we do not intend, presences we cannot control, evidence of realms we barely understand. The camera's mechanical eye sees without prejudice. It records what is there, but determining what is there becomes infinitely complex once we acknowledge that there might contain more than our limited perceptions allow. Some stories preserve fear. The Haraway photograph could be read as horror, a ghost story, a cautionary tale about the dangers of excessive grief, a reminder that death's boundaries exist for protective reasons. But David does not experience the image as frightening. He experiences it as heartbreaking. 2 daughters who should have grown old, married, had children of their own, lived full lives. Instead, one died at 16 months, and one disappeared at 10. And they exist now only in this single photograph, frozen forever in a moment that should have been joyous, but became the pivot point of tragedy. Others preserve love that refused to fade. This reading feels closer to truth. Margaret loved Constance so completely that she could not let her go. And Constance, or whatever Constance had become, loved her family enough to return when invited. The tragedy was not the love, but the collision between love and reality, between what should be possible and what actually occurred, between a mother's need and a ghost's loneliness and a sister's vulnerability. The motif transforms one final time. Perhaps there were never 5 chairs, only 4, and one memory that refused to leave. Perhaps the 5th chair was always empty, and what the photograph captured was emptiness given temporary form, absence made briefly present, the ghost of a ghost. Perhaps Margaret's grief was so powerful it convinced even a camera to see what she saw, to record her interior reality as if it were external fact. Or perhaps none of this speculation matters. Perhaps the truth is simpler and stranger. Perhaps Constance was there. Perhaps Clara joined her. Perhaps they remain together in whatever space exists beyond the surface of that photograph, in the chemical layers of the emulsion, in the grain of the silver crystals, in the ones and zeros of digital scans. Together, as the voice in David's recording claimed, together in a way that defies our understanding but might constitute its own form of happiness. History records what is seen. Birth certificates and death certificates and census records and marriage licenses and property deeds. The official documentation that proves existence and tracks its trajectory from beginning to end. These records show that Constance Haraway died in 1896. They show that Clara Haraway disappeared in 1904 and was never found. They show that Margaret Haraway lived until 1942, a widow for the last 14 years of her life, estranged from her surviving children who could not understand her grief and eventually stopped trying. But grief records what is felt, the interior truth that official history cannot capture, the weight of absence, the phantom pain of love that has nowhere to direct itself, the refusal to accept that death is final, that loss is permanent, that the dead stay dead no matter how desperately we call them back. Margaret's grief is preserved in that photograph as surely as her daughter's faces. It is there in the fifth chair, in the too wide smile, in the candle that burns without flame. It is there in every enhancement, every analysis, every attempt to understand what should be impossible. The Haraway birthday remains somewhere in between. Not quite history because it defies historical fact. Not quite myth because the evidence exists, tangible and testable. Not quite ghost story because the horror is subsumed by sadness. Not quite tragedy because it contains the possibility of reunion, of love persisting, of consciousness surviving the body's failure. The photograph will outlive everyone who currently views it, will outlive David and the archivists and the skeptics and the believers, will outlive the technology used to store and display it, though it will be translated into new formats as old ones become obsolete. Eventually, it will outlive Millbrook itself, which will fade into nothing as small towns do, its buildings collapsing, its cemetery overgrown, even its name forgotten except in historical records that fewer and fewer people consult. But for now, it remains. 5 children around a birthday cake on March 17, 1904, 4 of whom we can name and trace and understand, and 1 who exists in that liminal space between presence and absence, between the documented and the impossible, between what the camera saw and what could not have been there. She looks back at us across 121 years, smiling her too wide smile, watching us with her too sharp eyes, inviting us to see what Margaret saw, to acknowledge what the camera recorded, to admit that the boundaries we draw between possible and impossible, between living and dead, between reality and whatever lies beyond it, might be more permeable than we prefer to believe. The 5th child sits in her chair. Her hands are folded in her lap. The candle before her burns with light that comes from no flame. And she waits, patient as only the dead can be patient, for someone to truly see her, to recognize her, to remember that she was there, that she is still there, that she will always be there. 5 chairs, 1 too many. Or perhaps 5 chairs, each one necessary, each one holding someone who needed to be held, each one part of a family photograph that captured more than any family photograph should. Each one a testament to the truth that love, in its most desperate and most powerful forms, can blur the lines between what is and what was, and what can never be again but exists anyway, in the spaces we create through sheer force of refusal to let go. This is what the photograph teaches us. This is its legacy. Not fear, but sorrow, not horror, but recognition. The understanding that every image we capture might contain more than we intend. That every moment we try to preserve carries with it all the moments that preceded it, all the absences it tries to fill, all the grief and love and desperate hope we bring to the act of looking and being looked at. The Haraway birthday happened on March 17, 1904. 4 children sat for a photograph. 1 child appeared who should not have been there. 1 child disappeared who should have remained. And a mother's grief became stronger than death, if only for the fraction of a second when the shutter opened and light poured through the lens, and chemistry did what chemistry does, preserved what was there without judgment, without understanding, without mercy. The photograph remains. The truth remains somewhere within it. And the 5th child, in her white dress with her hands folded, and her smile too wide and her eyes too knowing, remains as well, waiting, watching, remembering, refusing to be forgotten, refusing to be reduced to absence, insisting through her presence in that image that she was real, that she mattered, that her story deserves to be told even if it cannot be explained. We owe her that much. We owe both of them that much, Constance and Clara, the daughter who died and the daughter who disappeared, the child who should not be in the photograph and the child who should not have left it, the ghost and the victim and the sisters who found each other in whatever space exists between the living and the dead. They are together now. The voice said so, and perhaps that is enough. Perhaps that is the only truth that matters. Not how or why or whether it should be possible. Just that it is. That somewhere, preserved in silver and chemistry and light, 2 sisters sit together at a birthday party that happened 121 years ago. And they are smiling, and 1 candle burns, and time has stopped for them in a way it never stops for the living, holding them safe in that moment forever. The photograph is their monument, their testimony, their proof, and we, looking at it across more than a century, become witnesses to something we cannot fully comprehend but cannot entirely dismiss. We become part of their story by seeing them, by remembering them, by refusing to explain them away as double exposure or chemical error or obvious fabrication. 5 children in a photograph from 1904. This is what history records. This is what grief preserved. This is what the camera captured and what we, even now, struggle to understand. This is the Haraway birthday. This is the 5th child. This is what remains when love refuses to recognize death's authority. This is what happens when someone looks innocent until you enhance their face and see what hides there. Not evil, not horror, just truth, the hardest kind of truth. The kind that exists without permission, the kind that refuses to be forgotten, the kind that asks us to see beyond what should be possible and acknowledge what actually is. The photograph endures, the mystery endures, the children endure, and we, looking at them now, recognize something in that frozen moment that speaks to our own relationship with loss and love and the desperate human need to preserve what cannot be preserved, to hold on to what must inevitably slip away, to keep chairs set at our tables for those who will never return, but whom we cannot stop inviting back. 5 chairs, 5 children, 5 candles burning in the afternoon light of March 17, 1904. One of them burns still, will always burn, cannot be extinguished because it is fueled not by wax, but by something that does not consume itself, by memory, by grief, by love that survived death and found its way into chemistry and light, and this single photograph that asks more questions than it answers. This is the story. This is the truth as much as truth can be known. This is what remains after everything else has faded. The Haraway birthday, the 5th child, the photograph that should not exist but does, that shows what should not be there but is, that preserves what should have been forgotten but refuses to fade. Look closely at her face. See what hides there in the grain of the emulsion. See what Margaret saw. See what the camera recorded. See what 121 years have not been able to erase. See her. Remember her. Let her story live in your memory as she lives in that photograph, forever young, forever present, forever smiling her too wide smile and watching with her too knowing eyes. She is there. She was always there. She will always be there. The fifth child, the one too many, the one who made the number wrong and the truth impossible and the photograph eternal. This is her legacy. This is what she teaches us, that some presences cannot be erased, that some truths cannot be explained, that some love refuses to recognize the boundaries between what is and what should not be. The photograph remains. The mystery remains. The truth remains hidden and revealed in equal measure, preserved in chemistry and light, and the impossible image of 5 children at a birthday party where only 4 should have been. This is the story of the Haraway birthday. This is the story of the 5th child. This is the story of what happens when grief becomes powerful enough to reshape reality. This is what endures when everything else has faded into history. This single photograph, this impossible truth, this testament to love that refused to let go, even when letting go was the only mercy left to offer. Remember them. Remember all 5 of them, the 4 who were there and the 1 who should not have been, but was anyway. Remember that March day in 1904 when the camera opened its eye and saw more than anyone intended. Remember that sometimes the most innocent moments contain the deepest mysteries. Remember that history and grief and love all preserve different truths, and sometimes those truths collide in ways we cannot understand but cannot deny. The 5th child is still there, in her chair, at her birthday party, waiting, watching, smiling, and 1 candle burns. 1 candle will always burn, forever.